Wie zat die brengetje die wel bekende zachte geef. Leverance, bodypain, op mijn lijf geschreven. Leef ik hier, vlieren fluitend in het diepe zuiden. Geen voorraadkassen van 2000 als je liedjes luistert. Achterliggende boodschappen die heb ik niet dus. Leun terug en luister vlugje Limburgeringscursus. I swing it from the south, holding it down.
Welcome to this two-part special of Zachte GTV on Detroit. Welcome to Detroit, the Big D. Cliché number one about Detroit is probably ruin porn. Abandoned buildings that are filmed because of their urban decay. But I want to use this atmosphere to tell you something about the history of Detroit. And of course, the most important thing about the history of Detroit is car manufacturing. That's why Detroit is called Motor City. Ford started here and he revolutionized production, not only car production, but production in general. And cars made Detroit big, real big. And the interesting fact is that every worker could afford his own Cadillac, Ford, or GM, whatever. After the war, the car industry got even bigger. People lived in suburbia now, or moved there. That's called urban sprawl. And they had two cars. Urban sprawl got even bigger after the '68 riots. So the urban decay already started with the white flight and the urban sprawl in the 60s, leaving downtown neighborhoods empty. But the real economic blow came in the 70s with the first oil crisis, and car manufacturing went down. It went down very hard, leaving the economy upside down. So this is just a cliché, and history is more complicated than this. So be sure to check out the Wikipedia pages. Six entrepreneurs from Limburg traveled to Detroit and the Rust Belt to explore best practices and strategies for the creative industries in the context of a shrinking city. For Marcel, Maurice, Mark, Joost, Joris and Egit, the extremes found here could be the spark that was needed to change things in Limburg. Maybe we were searching for hope in what felt as an empty city, having lost a quarter of its population the last 10 years. But first of all, we needed to understand Detroit, what its problems were and what its strengths. We met John Gallagher, journalist and writer of the book Reimagining Detroit.
For a long time, people simply hoped that the old ways would come back, that this crash that we've had would just be like all the others that we've had, where you go down for a while and then come back up and things are great again. And now we understand that that's not going to happen. And so we're trying to reinvent our economy and the way we govern ourselves and our school system and everything all at the same time. And we're in the early stages of that. But I think that at least people are, as I say, we're awake, we're paying attention, we're asking the right questions now.
A lot of possible answers to these questions came from young people. For instance, Sarah from Glue Conference or Norma from Lafayette Gardens.
So if Detroit, where I live, doesn't come up with some better transportation options, we're going to continue to lose the battle over having young educated people live there. And you can't survive in this economy if you don't have some portion of your population, a pretty significant part of it, holding college degrees.
I can get a position with a volunteer organization to work in gardens and then make scholarship money to go to college and then come back to the city. Then look, we've created something sustainable here versus having all these people come in and learn from Detroit and then leave again. And So it's trying to like reimagine some of those ideas.
A great deal of change coming at us. Detroit is on a long but slow road up. Public transport, school systems and urban gardens, reimagining policies and binding young educated people to the city. Someone who is working on this constantly is Matt Clayson, director of the Detroit Creative Corridor Center. This institution is developing the creative industry in Detroit through microfunding, events and acquisition of creative companies. We were invited for dinner to his caringly renovated house from the heydays of Detroit.
There is a good quality of life here. There's a lot of solidly middle-class people who still live in the city. There's a lot of families who still live in the city. There's a ton of people who still care who live in the city. And they're doing their part to make the city a better place. And in fact, technically, according to the census, there's 400,000 people who are not in poverty who live in the city. That's bigger than most cities in this country. They always focus on, oh my gosh, but when I drive to your neighborhood, I saw a burnt out house and a lot of fields. Well, yeah, and you also drove through 10 blocks of stable middle-class housing before that, and you've come to a neighborhood with 400 stable middle and upper-class homes. And yeah, you drove through 5 blocks of areas where neighborhoods once were and now they're fields. And that's not a good thing, but it's the reality of it, and that's the landscape of Detroit. And so complex. It's hard to find another city in the country which has done more to change kind of the course of the world and the landscape of the world than Detroit. To mass produce a vehicle that has altered landscapes around the world, to mass produce sound that has altered the theory of music. We know how to buy things, of course, consumer society. We also know how to make things. And unfortunately, over the past 20 years, that's been lost in a lot of areas except for Detroit and Michigan. We still make cars, we still make office furniture, we still make chemicals, we still make cereal, we still grow our own food here. Find me a state in the union which can say that. But what the problem with the type of entrepreneurship we were doing is it was tied to one industry, that it was part of one supply chain. It wasn't part of a more global view. And so when the big three went on the skids, that whole supply chain followed. And there was no transfer of technology from the automotive sector to other sectors. And I think that's a hard lesson that we learned in the past 5 years, is that we need to, whatever type of business that we own, we need to make sure that that technology or that work we're doing translates across multiple sectors and is not just so hyper-specialized to relate to one industry.
Reconnecting with your strengths seems to be a central theme in the work of Matt, but also looking at the upside of things. New attention for making and designing has really got us to understand Detroit a little better. This won't make up for all the problems immediately, but for starters, Detroit has begun to realize things are going to need to change.
Well, just in the last few years, Detroit has understood that it needs to reinvent itself, that the old successful economy of the 1950s is not coming back. The population's not going to come back anytime soon. So we have to come up with a new basis for the city. And so Detroit is trying to reinvent its government, it's trying to reinvent its economy on a more entrepreneurial basis, and it's trying to reinvent its basic landscape, looking at things like greenways and urban gardens and reforestations and a lot of other things. So Detroit really understands that it needs to reinvent itself sort of top to bottom.
How Detroit is changing and how this could inspire Limburg, we will highlight in the second part of this special. For now, I want to leave you with one question. How big is the need for Limburg to reinvent itself?